much hope that these fellowships and the grants will be successful. It will help to understand scleroderma better for the benefit of our patients. With this, I would like to thank you, and I would like to turn the chair over to Marco again.
Thank you, Thomas, for being with us today. Really, thank you. So it's my great pleasure now to call the two moderators to continue this session and to pray all the others to have a seat. And so Sue Farrington, President of FESCA, and Piet van Riel, Professor Piet van Riel, will take now the moderation.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to be the co-hosts for the rest of this program and take you on a journey this afternoon exploring the development and creation of the World Scleroderma Foundation, and to be highlighting some of the amazing achievements that have been gathered over the last 20 years. But before we do this, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. As Marco has already alluded to, Professor Dame Carol Black will be a familiar face to many of you. She was a pioneer and a trailblazer in research for scleroderma, alongside how people were treated and how they were cared for. And today, Dame Carol is still leading the way, championing the rights of older people, as well as advocating for improvements in mental health and well-being. But today we are delighted to welcome her to the stage to give the opening lecture, The Pillars of Scleroderma.
Sue, thank you very much. Good afternoon. And can I say just what a unique pleasure it is to be with you all. I just feel very honoured and humbled that I've become the patron of the WSF, and I just hope that I can be of use and benefit to it as we go forward. My job is really to take us back a bit to the beginning of scleroderma. There are some in the audience today who, like me, date back over 40 years. I became interested in scleroderma in 1976 as a young doctor, so that ages me considerably. But there are many here who wouldn't have been there at the beginning. But I want you to think about whose shoulders do you stand on? What are the pillars of scleroderma that we should acknowledge? Of course, the last 10 years has really moved fast, but I think there are some important things that we should remember. Marco has just mentioned Osler, but of course it goes back before that. Hippocrates and Galen described what possibly could have been scleroderma. And most of you will know that modern scleroderma really dates to around 1945. Goetz described systemic sclerosis. And remember, that was only 5 years after the death of Paul Klee. And we have already seen many of his paintings showed on the screen. But of course, nobody describes this dreadful disease worse than Paul Klee. You can see it absolutely from his earlier paintings, which I put on the slide here, through to those dreadful examples of when he could no longer really use his hands. There is no better demonstration of this disease. There are many people whose shoulders we stand on, but I hope you'll forgive me if I choose one particular man. And I've chosen him because of his heritage. Jerry Rodden, albeit an American, actually has his forebears in Italy and in Poland. And he really held on to those connections. And many of you will know that Jerry worked so hard with Italian researchers and, of course, in Italy. He was a big man in every sense of the word. And many of you in the audience will remember him. But he was a great physician who really started us all off on the modern journey. Born and raised in New York, but this was really where his connection started. He was almost the beginning of international scleroderma. And Professor Maria Giordano in Naples was a great colleague of his. And of course, Stephanie Jablonska really worked closely with Jerry. And he was a huge support to her through very difficult political times. But I thought because we're in Milan, we should pay homage almost to the man who really started us off. Just about 2 weeks before Jerry died, he phoned me. I think he knew he was very, very ill and said to me, "You will carry on, won't you, Carol?" So I suppose, well, of course I had to say yes, and I had to carry on. But my memories of Jerry are extremely, extremely fond. And he would have loved to know that we were celebrating in Italy today, and he would certainly have enjoyed the food. I then just want to remind you all in a way of perhaps the very beginnings of international meetings. This one had a very scientific bent. It was in the 1980s. I hope that some of you will recognize some of the people on this slide. It was a mixture of basic science. Darwin Prof is on this photograph, and also clinicians and clinician scientists interested in this disease. I organised this meeting at a place called the Concrete Centre at Slough, near to Heathrow Airport. And there you will see the great Joe Corn. And I felt I must mention Joe. I still miss him. I worked with him for many years, but there he is looking well. And of course, Yoni Wito is there, the importance of dermatology to scleroderma, and Sergio and Alan Bailey. And there's one man on this slide that I can't put a name to, I'm ashamed to say, but he was a scientist from the States. And I need to go back and look him up. But following on from that, there were other early workshops. They were very early, and of course, it was slow progress in the beginning. And this montage takes us up to 2012, because we're really celebrating the last decade. I will have missed people off this montage for sure, but I hope you will all forgive me if I just pick out one particular name, and that is Carwell Leroy, because I know Marco owes a great debt of gratitude to Carlo and went to his lab. And a lot of people in this room will acknowledge the great contribution that Carwell made. And of course, on this photo is Tom, who's not with us from the States. Lots of people here, but it's on their shoulders, some who've passed on, some who are still alive today, that you stand, particularly the youngsters in the audience, that you stand to take forward the work. We are really a continuum. No one is so much more important than the other. We're all trying, as Marco and Tom said, to improve this for our patients, which makes me want to recognize what the patients and their organizations have taught us. I still get letters from my patients. I still love to hear from them, and I handed over to Chris many years ago, and in 3 weeks' time I'm going to have lunch with the youngster. She was in fact 2 and a bit when I diagnosed her scleroderma, who's now a very successful businesswoman, I'm delighted to say, but every year she contacts me and we go somewhere together. So patients and their organisation, and FESCA and these Scleroderma World Congress coming very much together to be a joint effort on this. We can't do anything without our patients. So they too are our pillars, and they have taught us a huge amount. But let me move quickly to this past decade. And you've heard some of the things that I'm probably going to repeat. When I first got interested in scleroderma, there were no treatments for the disease. We sat by the beds of our dying patients. There was nothing for lung fibrosis, nothing for the kidneys, nothing for lung fibrosis, nothing really for the gut. We did our best, but our best was very inadequate considering the problems we were facing. But now we have approved therapies for pulmonary hypertension, digital ulcers, we have EUSTAR, we have WSF, and we have the Systemic Sclerosis World Congress, which is really so complementary to the slightly more scientific-based one that happens on alternate years. We're so privileged to have a clinical conference that really disseminates and educates about systemic sclerosis. So all of those things have been a wonderful development. And although they've been mentioned, I'm going to just emphasize some key recent advances in scleroderma. The ACR-EULAR classification criteria, VEDOS, the earlier diagnosis, EULAR treatment recommendations, approved therapies for complications of systemic sclerosis, and a flourishing clinical trial portfolio and landscape. So just to pull out one or two facts about these really important ones. First of all, updating criteria for scleroderma classification and diagnosis. All of you in this room will know just what an important piece of work that has been to include nail capillaroscopy and hallmark antibodies, external validation and underpinning multiple key research projects and aspects of clinical practice. Do not underestimate just how much work goes in to doing something like that. And then, of course, very early diagnosis for systemic sclerosis. That has already been mentioned, but it was a flagship EUSTAR project. It complemented the updated classification criteria with emphasis on early detection and diagnosis. So again, gradually and almost with more momentum, we have been building in the last 10 years. And then the EULAR recommendations for systemic sclerosis management that have happened over several years. And I hope I've acknowledged those who should be acknowledged for their very hard work in this really important area. And then, of course, most importantly, to our patients, approved therapies. And again, we're very lucky that we now have therapies for pulmonary hypertension, digital ulcers, and scleroderma lung disease. And I've put on this slide, please forgive me if you were also deeply involved in this, but I've tried to highlight the people who have really been instrumental here in the approved therapies. And we've now got a very fertile landscape for clinical trials. We've got much better trial design, we've got improved endpoints, we have a lot of cross-disciplinary learning, we are beginning to offer patients real hope with pulmonary hypertension and interstitial lung disease. When I started, you couldn't really interest a pharmaceutical company, hardly, in scleroderma, a rare disease, and why would you be interested as a pharmaceutical company? That has completely and wonderfully changed. And we have WSF, we have EUSTAR, and we have SCTC. So I think we should really celebrate our last 10 years. And my final slide reminds me that when I started, and other people in this audience, to be interested in scleroderma, when we talked about pathogenesis, we used to put a fibroblast on the slide. We would put an endothelial cell, and we thought, as Alan really kept reminding us, that the immune system was important. But we had nothing, like you see here. we now have so many points at which we have emerging therapies. We have moved so far in the last 10 years, and that is due to many of you in the audience today, and to those of you just at the beginning or still very actively involved in your research career. It is now for you, and it will be on your shoulders, that Scleroderma will go forward. So thank you very much. I hope it's just given you a brief bit of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction for this meeting, Professor Dame Carol Black. And